All right. Wow, what a turnout. Thank you, CHHB, and whomever else is here. My name is Lorraine Collins. I'm a professor in community health and health behavior, and it's been my pleasure to serve as a co-mentor for our candidate today, Kate Rogers, who is going to be presenting her dissertation research. So let me give you a little bit of background with regard to Kate's education and research activities and so forth. Since 2020, she has been in the doctoral training program for CHHB, where she's been co-mentored by Dr. Tia Palermo, who's an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health. I have to pause to thank Tia, deeply thank Tia for her mentoring, because as you will see, some of the data that's presented here is from Tanzania, and we got access to that data through Tia. So anyway, can't stop singing your praises, Tia. From 2018 to 2020, Kate earned an MPH in CHHB with her mentor, Dr. Greg Homish. And prior to that, she got a BA in English literature from SUNY Geneseo. So a product of SUNY, we're so proud. So her research positions in the past couple of years have involved the 2PE lab at UB, which is headed by Tia, and that lab focuses on promoting health for marginalized people, including those living in poverty, women and girls, and adolescents and children. 2021 to the present, she's also been working for an LLC named Policy Research Solutions. And in that position, she's provided technical assistance, research support, and other activities related to projects by the United Nations, particularly UNICEF. And much of that work is focused on HIV, violence against women and children, particularly in low and middle income countries. And as part of that, Kate actually traveled to Tanzania a couple of times, because that's where these projects were located. And I think it also gave her a good feel for the data that she's working with in Tanzania. So prior to UB, Kate had community positions, particularly with Crisis Services of Buffalo, where she worked as a sexual violence prevention coordinator and a campus advocate, and at the Buffalo International Institute as immigrant domestic violence advocate. So I hope you're seeing a theme here. Because all of these topics and positions really just support Kate's passion, and she is very committed to women's issues, issues faced by disadvantaged populations, however you want to define them. And the commitment is really beyond, the academic research. It's very much the advocate and the passionate supporter. Kate's been involved in dissemination activities, including 4 publications one of which she first authored. And today you'll be hearing about actually 3 manuscripts. One's published, one's revised and resubmit, and one's under review. And she has 3 more manuscripts that are under review. She's got conference presentations and webinars on topics such as reducing HIV risk among adolescent girls. This past year, she received the honor of being selected a policy communication fellow from the Policy Communication Training Program at the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C., and that's ongoing until January. So lots going on in Kate's life and in her research. I'll turn it over to her, but again, on behalf of her dissertation committee, I think I can say that it's been a pleasure to watch Kate grow and blossom and own all of the research that she'll be presenting to you today. So I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Lorraine. That makes me sound a lot cooler than I am, I feel like. So thank you. So as Lorraine said, can everyone can hear me okay? We are here to talk about my dissertation, the gender norms and attitudes in the sexual behavior and values of Tanzanian young people and African immigrant young women in the US. This is the condensed version of this title. We worked on it a lot. I do just want to acknowledge my committee. This is cute. Okay, before we start, as Lorraine said, Lorraine is my co-chair along with Tia, and then we have Jennifer Livingston here and Meghna Ranganathan, who is joining us from London on Zoom. I would literally not be able to be up here without any of you today, and I appreciate the enormous workload you've undertaken to mentor me and coach me and really help me just become the researcher I am. So thank you all. Okay, so I want to just go through a little roadmap of where we're headed for the next hour or so. We're going to go through the background and the conceptual framework that I've grounded this research in, and then we're going to move through the specific aims. So I used the 3-paper model for those of you familiar. So each study that you see here corresponds with a separate paper. And then we're going to talk about the overall conclusions from this research and its implications for public health, because that is what we all love to talk about here. So what are gender norms? Pretty basic to understand, but it's kind of important to level set here. Oh my gosh, sorry. I'm a Mac user, so I'm like I don't know how to use a PC. So gender norms are a subset of social norms. And those social norms are simply our social contract, how we all agree to move through the world based on our understanding of societal and cultural acceptance. So, sure. Okay, I'm just gonna do that. How's that? Beautiful. Okay. And then gender norms are a subset of those social norms. So they are our understanding of the behaviors, activities, and attributes expected of someone based on their gender or their biological sex. So very importantly, we understand that gender exists on a continuum, but for the purposes of this research, I'm talking about men and women. And also very importantly, gender norms themselves are not inherently harmful. Where they start to become harmful is when they start to tip and one gender is privileged over another. So in patriarchal societies, which the US and Tanzania both are largely, and that's where my research is, we tend to have patriarchal values. And so men in our society are valued over women. And so when we talk about gender norms, they set the stage of how women are meant to act in comparison with or in deference to men. And so once you have this inequitable power dynamic, these norms uphold and reinforce that, and that's where they start to become harmful. And we learn from a really young age how to do gender. So we watch our parents, we watch the roles that get assigned to people in our lives, in our homes, our siblings, based on their gender. And as we grow up, those things get reproduced and reinforced through all the different institutions that we move through. So where we go to school, where we work, the places we worship, all of those reinforce the ways that we understand gender and our role in it. Okay, now that works. That's great. Gender attitudes are also a really important component to understanding gender norms, because attitudes can drive norms and norms can drive attitudes. So it's kind of this constant feedback loop, setting sort of the behavioral standards. And an attitude is just simply a person's opinion about a norm. And it can be aligned with the norm or against the norm. And that sort of happens in alignment with our reference groups. So we all belong to a bunch of different reference groups in our lives. We have our families, we have our peers, we have our classmates, and how we act may differ from group to group. These groups dictate their members' normative behavior, and they shape all our values and our ideas and ultimately drive our behaviors. So I may come from a really conservative family and act one way in that family in order to be accepted there, but have a very liberal, wild, crazy group of friends and act a very different way around those friends in order to be accepted there. So they're really important in understanding gender norms. And I promise by the time we finish this, you're all going to be experts in gender attitudes too. So what do these all have to do with sexual risk behavior? As it turns out, kind of a lot. So we're going to talk about it in the African, specifically the Tanzanian context first. So in Tanzania, gender inequality leaves women with less access to resources and opportunities than men. Women have lower rates of secondary education in Tanzania. There are often lower paying jobs, or jobs where they are working primarily in the domestic sphere. And so this sets them up for a host of different sexual risk behaviors, specifically age disparate partnerships. And this is typically anywhere like 5 years or greater for that disparity, with a younger girl and an older man, because older men have better access to financial resources. This can lead to something called transactional sex, which again, you're all going to be experts in it when we leave here. But it is a non-marital sexual relationship where sex is exchanged for or in anticipation of money or goods. And typically it is the woman exchanging sex and the man exchanging the goods. And this can leave a power disparity in that relationship because the man has the resources that the woman needs, and it can make it really difficult to negotiate when, whether, or how to have sex, because there is no upfront negotiation. It's very different from sex work in that you don't lay the parameters before it happens. So things like sex without a condom, coercive sex, rape, those things all start to happen in those relationships. And then ultimately, this increases the risk of violence against women and girls overall. In the US, this looks a little bit different. So we don't have sex ed widely available in the US. Where it is available, there is no standardized curriculum. That could be a soapbox for another day. I could have done a whole thesis on that. But when you don't have that available, there's that dearth of information. And so adolescents start to seek information from other places, the internet, TikTok, YouTube, all these things that I probably don't even know about. And they may find good information out there, but they also may find misinformation. And when they don't have that critical understanding to know what they're looking at, this can reinforce really negative tropes. So misogynistic tropes in pornography are very common. Things that say men need sex more than women do, or women being submissive, non-consensual, unsafe sex. And this gets reinforced if their peers are also learning about that from the same space, because peer knowledge and norms are super important in adolescence. The reason why we have sort of chosen this time is because when you're an adolescent, it's sort of when you start to shape your worldview around gender, and you solidify how gender roles are meant to be, but you're also malleable enough that it's a good time to intervene. So it's really important to understand how those peer groups influence adolescents when we're going through all of this research. I'm so used to saying, anybody have any questions? Because I usually present to like high schoolers. You can't ask questions yet. Then lastly, we're going to talk about gender norms and immigrant youth in the third paper. So there's a pretty robust amount of evidence that shows that gender norms from the heritage country someone has migrated from influence behavior in the United States. So a first generation immigrant is someone who has been born in one country and migrated to the US. Second generation is someone born to immigrant parents in the US. And immigrant youth, especially adolescents, experience conflicting values, because going back to that idea of reference groups, they've got one reference group in their family and their immigrant community, giving them one set of values, and very likely a different set of normative influences from their peers or other people they engage with in the US. And this, especially for girls, can cause tension between them and their families. There is a disproportionate burden of family obligation for girls in immigrant families as opposed to their boy siblings. So now that we kind of have a good idea of the background of where we're headed, we're going to talk about the conceptual frameworks. I have two frameworks that grounded this research. The first being the social ecological model, which is Lorraine's favorite. So, if anyone knows Lorraine. And this is simply a multi-level framework that looks at all the complex and concurrent influences of each level of this framework on the other. So we are individual people who have relationships or reference groups as we move through our communities, such as our neighborhoods, our workplaces, that sort of are dictated by these overarching societal norms, policies, laws. And these things, similar to the way that attitudes and norms can influence each other, that's kind of the visual of how that works. And really importantly, gender equity can't be achieved without every level of this model getting incorporated. So a lot of interventions, particularly those in Africa, Tia and I have been working on a systematic review that is awful. And a lot of them target adolescent girls and young women because they are the most vulnerable to things like HIV and gender-based violence, which is great. And they provide them with sexual education and reproductive health knowledge. However, if you're just giving that information to those girls and they're living in a community that still says, like we expect child marriage and we expect you to be someone who labors at home or whatever the norms of that community are, she's liable to be more sanctioned by the community with that information because the rest of these levels have not been incorporated in that change. So putting the onus on the most vulnerable person is not really effective. So we need it at every level. The next theory that I use is actually my favorite one. It's a sociology theory. It's not a public health theory. And it's called the theory of gender and power. And it works really similarly to the social ecological model in that there are 3 structures that influence gendered relationship. And those are the sexual division of labor, the sexual division of power, and something called cathexis, which is our social norms. Division of labor is what it sounds like. It's unequal pay in the labor force. It is unequal division of domestic labor at home. Sexual division of power is lack of control or autonomy. So it looks like things like reproductive rights, the idea of like birth spacing and being able to choose when you get pregnant. It's also freedom of choice for women not being confined by gender roles. So being able to choose to work outside of the home or have different things in your life besides child rearing and those traditional gender roles. And then cathexis is these affective and social exposures that make the norms biased against women. So it's what I talked about at the very beginning, these reproductions and reinforcements of normative behavior at all of the different ways that we move through the world. Okay, so now we're getting into the good stuff. So as I said before, I use the 3-paper model. So we have 3 aims or 3 studies. And all of them have this overarching research question, which is how do cultural and community gender norms and attitudes influence individual sexual behaviors and values in adolescents and young people? Brevity is not my thing, in case you're picking up the pattern here. So in our first study, we examine the influence of both community and individual level gender equitable attitudes on adolescent sexual behavior. And this was boys and girls in rural Tanzania. In our second paper, we explored perceived community attitudes and norms surrounding kudanga, which is a type of transactional sex, and how the internalization of norms surrounding intimate partner violence might influence kudanga. And this took place in urban Tanzania. And then our final paper jumped over to the US, where we explored African immigrant young women's perceptions of both family and peer gender norms and the interplay of those on sexual behavior, decision-making, and relationship values of these young women. So we're going to get much more detailed about all of these. So jumping into study 1, we asked 2 questions for this one. First being, what is the association between community gender equitable attitudes, individual level gender equitable attitudes, and individual sexual risk behavior? And this was among boy and girl adolescents. And then the second is there a difference in that association between males and females? So there's quite a bit of existing literature on community norms and sexual risk behavior. We were particularly interested in 2018, Pettifor and colleagues examined a community mobilization intervention that talks about things like sexual risk behavior and gender roles and things of that nature with the community. And what they found was that it reduced negative gender norms among men and reduced the number of sexual partners among women. So it had attitudes and behavior sort of involved in this. And then in 2022 in India, Andrew and colleagues conducted an intervention that had 2 arms, one that was girls only. So it was girls receiving sexual health education and empowerment. And then another arm that included that plus community discussions with norm influencers. So people who held some weight in the community. And what they found was that in the group with the norm influencers, there were reduced sanctions for norm breaking and better mental well-being for the adolescent girls in that group. So community is important. And so based on that, we hypothesized that communities with higher gender equitable attitudes in our own research was going to have lower sexual risk behavior. So I used secondary data from a mixed methods cluster randomized controlled trial that Dr. Palermo was the PI on. It was in rural Tanzania, and the data collection occurred over 3 waves in 2017 to 2019. They went door to door to households, and the intervention was basically two-armed. One was cash only, and then the other one was cash plus an adolescent-focused intervention. So sexual health, education, vocational training, those kinds of things with boys and girls. And so we used the study data from waves 2 and waves 3 because the baseline adolescents, not enough of them had sexually debuted for our sample to make sense. So we included unmarried youth as well because we use transactional sex and the measure indicates that it is unmarried sex. Our sample was ages 16 to 21, and there were overall 2,017 of them, 865 females, 1,152 males. So to create our predictor variables, we used a measure called the Gender Equitable Men Scale, or the GEM scale. And it was initially designed to look at the attitudes of adolescent boys towards gender norms in Brazil. It's since been tested and validated for use in a host of low and middle income countries. And so it's simply a 24-item scale that measures these attitudes about norms. And it works across 4 domains where men and women are in relationship with each other. So intimate partnerships, reproductive health, domestic life, and violence. And it asks questions or makes statements, really. Things like men need sex more than women do, or a woman's job is to take care of her home and her family. And then the response options range from 1 to 3, where a higher response equals more equitable attitudes. So from this scale, we made 2 predictor variables, the first being individual level GEM scores. So we took the responses to all of those 24 items on the scale, again, ranging from 1 to 3, 3 being a higher score, a more gender equitable score. And the mean here was 2.2. And then we created an additive scale from there where the range was 24 to 72, the mean being 52.7. And then we broke that scale into tertiles to indicate low, medium, and high scores. And you can see those cut points here. And then we broke it into community level scores as well. So importantly, community here is just those adolescents. It is not reflective of other community members. When we're saying community, it's really more like peer community members. And we took those individual GEM scores and clustered them at the village or the community level. So we had 130 villages. Their GEM score mean was 52.7. And then we did this by making non-self-clustered means. And essentially, we took the index individual out in order to preserve that exogenous nature of the variable so that that individual score is not included in the mean of the community when we're trying to understand the community's effect on their behavior or their attitudes. And then we broke those into tertiles just like we did for the individual scores. So you can see here that range was 44 to 63. And then again, here were our various cut points. And we created a binary indicator where we took the low and the medium to equal 0 and the high to equal 1. So we had a lot of outcomes. We have 8 total, and we broke them into 2 separate primary and secondary outcomes. Our primary outcomes were tested on our full sample, all adolescents, whether they had sexually debuted or not. So that's 2017 of them. And they are engagement in transactional sex. And if someone hadn't debuted, we considered that protective behavior against transactional sex, which is why we measured it in this full sample. Early sexual debut, which is age 15 or younger to have debuted. And again, not debuting is protective here. And then HIV testing in the last 12 months. So in areas where HIV is prevalent, which this area of our study was, often adolescents get tested before they sexually debut because they may have been infected perinatally. Our secondary outcomes were tested only on our sexually debuted sample. So there are 619 of them, 281 females and 338 males. And those are modern contraceptive use, condom use at last sex, concurrent or multiple sexual partners, age disparate partnerships, which again, a disparity of 5 years or greater, and number of sexual partners in the last 12 months. So we conducted logistic regressions for both sets of outcomes where the behaviors from wave 3 were regressed on attitudes at wave 2. So we made a lag term that just allowed us to sort of compare that change over time between waves 2 and waves 3. We used 2 models. The first one included only our community gender equitable attitudes. The second included community and individual gender equitable attitudes. We controlled for age, sex, education, whether they had received the intervention, and whether there was a female head of household. We used robust standard errors at the community level to account for the clustering of those variables. And then we did do formal testing for effect modification by sex. So what did we find? This is a lot going on here. So I'm gonna get rid of that for a second. But we, as I said, we had the pooled sample, male, female, everyone, whether they had sexually debuted or not. And then we did run those analyses stratified by sex. So we're gonna look at the pooled sample first of our full sample. And what we found here was that at the 10% level, there was significance between HIV testing and community high gender equitable attitudes, such that adolescents from communities with high gender equitable attitudes had approximately 30% increased odds of being HIV tested, as compared with those from low or medium gender equitable attitude communities. It's such a mouthful to say gender equitable attitude this many times. In our sexually debuted sample of both male and female, so that's 619, we found significant at the 5% level an association between age disparate partnerships and community high gender equitable attitudes. So here, those adolescents from communities with high gender equitable attitudes had about 40% decreased odds of participating in age disparate sex. So for our female sample, again, I'm going to kind of remove the debuted ones for now. We found fairly similar results. So in model 1 at the 10% level and in model 2 at the 5% level, girls from communities with high gender equitable attitudes had about 50% increased odds of being HIV tested, so a little higher than the pooled sample. In our secondary outcomes, so among sexually debuted females, there were 281 of them. We also found significant at the 5% level, 50% decreased odds of having age disparate sex. And then individual high gender equitable attitudes, so girls who held high gender equitable attitudes themselves, we saw a twofold odds increased use of modern contraceptive use and condom use. So importantly, we did not find any significant associations in our male-only analysis with any of our outcomes. So these significant findings in the pooled sample were really driven by the females. So in our effect modification by sex, we did find quite a few variables modified by sex. So what you're seeing here are our stratified model results. I want to look at all the screens. I was trying to point out. So we use ordinary least squares regressions for this, and the p-value that you're looking at up here comes from our pooled sample with the fully interacted model. So high gender equitable attitudes were interacted with the female variable. And what we found was for community level attitudes, at the 5% level, there was evidence of effect modification by sex for age disparate partnerships. At the individual level, at the 10% level, we found evidence for HIV testing and modern contraceptive use, and then at the 5% level for condom use at last sex. So these results were driven by females, and there was evidence of effect modification by sex. So what does it all mean? This is the part where it gets good. So overall, we concluded that adolescents actually are susceptible to perceived community norms. And this idea of a pro-social perspective, so those positive norms really having an influence, because these communities that had higher gender equitable attitudes saw decreased age disparate partnerships and increased HIV testing. So because of that, there may be less stigma around HIV health-seeking behavior in those communities. However, because it was driven by females, it is important for future research to examine how this looks for males as well. Again, we saw that gender equitable attitudes, in fact, can influence risk factors for transactional sex, particularly age disparate sex. And these attitudes among adolescent girls in particular may help overcome barriers to negotiating safe sex. So because these girls with high individual gender equitable attitudes had higher odds of using condoms and contraceptives, they either maybe are more knowledgeable or more comfortable negotiating this. And so again, important to kind of continue examining that and providing those interventions. The study had a number of strengths. First, we used longitudinal data. And as I said, it was household based, so it wasn't a convenient sample from a clinic. They went door to door with a pretty large data set. We used the GEM scale, which is a validated measure, and really allowed for context specific gender attitudes to be examined. And then we aggregated those attitudes at the village level. Our limitations are that those aggregated attitudes were only reflective of adolescence. And so we may have missed some important community drivers by not having people like teachers, parents, other community leaders. Our sample was from extremely poor households, so they may not be generalizable to different socioeconomic brackets. And then our sexually debuted sample, especially for females, was very small. So our lack of significant findings is maybe not reflective of the true relationship in the population, rather just that our sample is low powered. And then of course, social desirability when you're self-reporting sensitive things is always a risk. So overall, we concluded that gender equity has protective effects against sexual risk behaviors. Community gender attitudes are, in fact, important to understanding how these norms influence sexual behavior in adolescence. And it ultimately underscores the need for gender transformative programming in whole communities. And you can find this article at Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. I'm happy to share the DOI if anybody wants it afterwards. A little shameless plug here. Okay, study 2. So moving into young Tanzanian women's perceptions of community norms related to a type of transactional sex called kudanga. Are you sick of listening to me talk yet? So we asked 3 questions here. The first being, what is kudanga and why is it practiced? The second being, what are the community attitudes and norms surrounding kudanga and how might they influence individual participation in it? And the third being, how is the internalization of norms surrounding intimate partner violence potentially related to the experiences these young women have who engage in kudanga? There's quite a bit of existing literature about transactional sex in Africa. So one of them, Stovenow and colleagues in 2016 conducted a systematic review about transactional sex in Africa, and they found that it exists on a continuum. So it's not driven by extreme poverty alone. That could be one of the reasons, but it also could be things like improved social status, social capital, material expressions of love. So there are many reasons why women might engage in transactional sex, but whatever reason, gender inequality was a major structural driver for it. They had less access to resources than the men they were engaging in the transactional sex with. Ranganathan and colleagues, Ranganathan, who is on this call today, they found in 2017 that girls and women actually felt they had agency when they were selecting their partners for transactional sex. But once the exchange relationship was established and they had received the goods or the money, that balance of power tipped, and then they no longer had agency after that happened. And then in 2019, Wemoy and colleagues conducted a study in Tanzania that looked at how norms might influence participation in transactional sex. And what they found was that those norms differ greatly, but one of the consensuses was that it becomes exploitative when that balance of power tips and the man has more of the power than the woman does. So we use data from it's secondary qualitative data from a mixed method study. The study was originally designed to look at social networks and HIV risk levels for out of school adolescent girls and young women. And kudanga was never meant to be part of this. Transactional sex was never meant to be part of it, but the participants kept talking about kudanga. And so the research team decided they were going to put some focus groups together to better understand what this is. So 6 networks of women from that original study participated in 6 different focus groups. And those focus groups included topics on kudanga, intimate partner violence, sexual health, and vocational skills. So we conducted qualitative analyses on that focus group data using thematic content analysis as per Braun and Clark. So we created categories, different themes, and different sub-themes, and then we cross-analyzed those to look at the patterns both within and between the focus groups. And we identified 3 categories for our study based on our research questions. The first being doing kudanga, the second being community and individual attitudes toward kudanga, and the third being intimate partner violence. So our participants were 37 young women. They had a mean age of 22, and you'll see here that the range is a little higher than what we would categorize as young women. One of the groups had a few older women who were very established and part of their network, and so it was important for them to be part of that group still. They all came from very low socioeconomic status, so the research took place in a very poor area of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And so they had primary, some secondary education, and the majority worked low wage, low skill jobs, things like ice cream sellers. So what did we find? Well, we found that kudanga was an incredibly difficult term to define. Loosely, it's when a woman baits a man to have sex with her in exchange for material goods or money, with the hope that she's not actually going to have to follow through and have sex with him. So it was very ambiguous. The money and the goods were sort of the most important components. Kudanga was never premeditated, and there was a very strong relationship-like quality. So the women in our group were describing it as they might have multiple men that they did kudanga with. Each man might give them something different. And they might hang out with them and not exchange goods or sex at all. But there was always an understanding that that could happen. So it was almost a maintenance situation. However, one would never have a serious relationship with someone they did kudanga with. So you could have a husband, you could have a serious boyfriend, you could have men that you do kudanga with, but you would never have kudanga be your serious relationship. The women said that they did kudanga for a variety of reasons, so sort of supporting this continuum that Stovenow and colleagues identified. It was never acceptable, but it was less so if you wanted like goods or material things. So they spoke a lot about lusting after things and saying women had good homes and they had enough money, but they wanted more social status or things like phones and shoes. And so that was considered much worse than, say, a woman who was a widow trying to make extra income for her children. And then no matter why they were doing kudanga, it was considered to be easy money. So as I said, community attitudes towards kudanga were extremely negative. It was commonly practiced. The women in our group, focus groups, identified that it was a fairly normal thing to do. But even if you did it, even if you participated in it, you had to outwardly reject it because women were so stigmatized. One of the women said, "You're looked upon as a luxury tool. They're very objectified. You are something for men to do something with." So interestingly, the men who engaged in kudanga with these women were not as stigmatized. As we can see here by respondent 1 from focus group 4, the woman was always the one who bore the brunt of this stigmatization. And the community felt, and the women who did kudanga felt, that if she attempted to skin the goat or take the goods without giving the sex, the community could find her and return her to the man who she owed the sex to, and he could exact a payment from her. So that was an incredibly normalized theme. The women had very little ability to negotiate condom use then, again, sort of supporting what Ranganathan and colleagues found once this exchange was established. It was acceptable for men to take sex by force, as we can see here from respondent 6. It was a fairly normal thing to do. So women, in the lack of ability to negotiate condom use, they understood the risks that they were putting themselves in, but they felt that it was worth it in order to receive the goods that this man could provide. So if she negotiated condom use and the man said no, then she lost out on the goods or the resources that he could provide her, and some other woman would get those things. Violence in extreme was not typically tolerated. They indicated that it did happen, but it wasn't typically tolerated. It was very normalized, though, in all intimate partnerships, kudanga or otherwise. And the women indicated that they felt they largely brought this upon themselves, particularly in kudanga relationships. So because it was so stigmatized, if their husband found out they were doing kudanga, it was okay for him to become violent with her. Or if the kudanga partners found out you were doing kudanga with someone else, that was also okay to become violent. Because of this, the women were afraid to report the violence because there was so much victim blaming and stigma surrounding it. So lastly, kudanga, as I said earlier, was universally understood to be easy money and a way to supplement poor income. The women in our group, as I said before, were from extremely low socioeconomic backgrounds. So they indicated that while economic empowerment components, things like cash transfers or vocational training might be helpful, kudanga was so embedded and frankly so reliable that they weren't going to stop doing it entirely. And so they felt that the community should really not shun women who did kudanga. So overall, again, now the good stuff. What did we find from all of this? As far as we know, this is the first paper on kudanga. And it sort of reinforces what we know about transactional sex being deeply embedded and reliable, and that economic empowerment interventions alone are not going to eradicate this practice. It also expands the definition of transactional sex to include this full scope of romantic relationships and not just the sexual component. Men's control over women's autonomy was normalized as the price for women to pay to access the resources that men had. So even when they understood the risks, women were willing to placate men in order not to miss out on the resources they provided. And then lastly, community norms stigmatizing women for doing kudanga prevented them from reporting intimate partner violence of any kind. So this internalization of harmful norms led them to believe it was their fault. And then these institutional barriers, such as victim blaming, reinforced that this was not a safe thing to do, and it also allowed perpetrators of violence to continue unchecked. So we had some limitations. As I said multiple times, our participants were from very low socioeconomic backgrounds, so this may not translate to the formal labor sector or other socioeconomic backgrounds. And our focus groups didn't include men, so we are limited to the perceptions of women's views of kudanga. Overall, we concluded that a focus on community involvement on reducing risks for women who do kudanga is important. Are we seeing a theme yet? Understanding men's roles is going to be really important. There's some interesting research coming out of Uganda and Tanzania that shows adolescent boys are far more conflicted about the practice than their older male counterparts. Education around condom use and increasing women's agency for both men and women is going to be really important. And instilling safe reporting mechanisms for women who experience IPV so that they feel safer and can get more resources in reporting. And of course, more gender equitable policies and economic opportunities for women, which I think any of us who do this work will have jobs for a long time. So moving on. For our final study, we jumped over to the US and we looked at African immigrant young women and their perspectives on the norms from their heritage countries versus the US. So we had two questions for this one. The first being, are African immigrant young women's perceptions of family and peer gender norms reflected in their own sexual behavior, relationships, and decision-making? And then how does the interplay of those two sets of values either conflict or align to shape the behavior, decision-making, and relationship values for these young women? There's not actually a lot of existing literature on this. What we did find was that, again, going back to this idea of reference groups, immigrant youth tend to code switch between their families and their peers to gain acceptance in both groups, often to the detriment of their own well-being. And then in 2021, Mailer and colleagues conducted a systematic review of a host of different heritage countries and found that these really stringent traditional gender expectations for girls could result in a rejection of those values, as well as intergenerational conflict, again, because of this disproportionate burden of family obligation on those girls. So we recruited participants for the study from colleges in New York State. Natasha, thank you for helping with that. We used flyers, social media, word of mouth, and snowball sampling. And we conducted in-depth interviews via Zoom or the phone on topics including sexual health, gender roles, and intimate partnerships. To participate in this study, the women had to be 18 to 24 years old, have at least one parent from an African country, and speak English. Our participants were 14 young women with a mean age of 20. There were 8 first-generation immigrants and 6 second-generation immigrants. 10 were Christian and 4 were Muslim, and all but 1 were pursuing bachelor's degrees in the Sunni system. So again, Sunni kids. We conducted qualitative analyses. So we used an initial code book that was developed based off of the interview questions and then refined them through the blind coding of 2 transcripts with our whole research team. Logan, thank you for being the research team. We conducted thematic content analysis again here, where we created categories and themes, and then looked at the patterns both across and between the interviews. Excuse me. And then from there, we established 6 different categories. So community influence, household dynamics, family relationships, peer dynamics, sexual and reproductive health, and personal values. So there was quite a bit going on here. So what did we find? We found that the community influence, both here in the United States and in Africa was very strong on the participants' families. So there were norms that dictated the behavior for the families, both in the US and in Africa. There were very different standards for men and women, and culturally, girls were expected to care for men from a young age, as we can see here from participant 12. So young men in the community were expected to sort of be a little bit less conservative. They could have sex. They were expected to date before they were married. Young women were expected to abstain from sex and not casually date. And as one of the young women said, I'm not really sure who they're having sex with because they can't do it with any of us. So that's a fair point. Within the household, these community dynamics were reflected. So the men were the decision makers. Even when the women's mothers worked outside the home, and almost all of them did, they still bore the full burden of the domestic duties. So childrearing, cooking, cleaning. And where the mother needed support, the daughters were expected to come in and support that. Again, they had very different roles from their brothers. They were expected to help more with the family than their male siblings. And so because of that, these women felt a lot of pressure to be perfect. I think every single girl that I interviewed used that word multiple times. They felt like they had to keep their dating lives secret. So again, this idea of code switching between their families and their friends. They were really unprepared for anything involving sexual and reproductive health, menstruation, sex. All of these topics were very secret in their households, as participant 14 indicates to us here. So many of the girls didn't even know what sex was. They just said their mothers would tell them, don't have a boyfriend, you'll get pregnant. So there was a very big dearth of conversation and understanding around what sexual health was. Interestingly, many of these women's mothers were in arranged or unhappy marriages. And while on the one hand, they understood that as women, they wanted to child rear and care for their families and care for the men in their lives, they also didn't want their daughters to be in those same positions. And so even though they wanted them to get married and have children of their own, they wanted them to make their own money and not be dependent on a man. Overall, our participants, the majority of them had not yet sexually debuted, and they felt that their US peers were too cavalier with their sexual relationships. So they didn't feel like their peers had much influence on them in terms of peer pressure, but they did indicate that they were a good wealth of information when they did have questions about sex or any kind of reproductive health. And then finally, the women in our sample felt very conflicted between what they wanted and what was expected of them, as participant 1 indicates here. It was clear that family, cultural, and gender norms all had a pretty strong influence on the girls, but the family and cultural ties were stronger. As one of them said, I spent 8 hours a day with my friends and the rest of my life with my family. So of course they have a bigger influence on me. So the girls understood and recognized that many of them held pretty implicit biases about gender, and also understood that they didn't want that to happen or be reflected in their own relationships as they grew up. They saw their parents' relationships as very inequitable and felt that they wanted more fluid gender roles with their partnerships. They also didn't feel as beholden to the community norms as their parents did, and ultimately felt that it was their job to break this cycle of intergenerational silence about sex, the stigmas that women had experienced in their communities. And they really saw how the women in their own communities were suffering and didn't want to pass that on to their own children. So overall, we found that there was some pro-social influence from peers in the way that because these young girls did not have these sexual and reproductive health conversations at home, their female friends were really important to them in learning about their menstruation, having sex, sexuality, and because many of their friends were more sexually conservative, they were understanding better safe sex practices than they would have if they had friends who were much more sexually cavalier. From a family standpoint, there was a positive influence in that they instilled these conservative cultural values. And so there were later sexual debuts. The girls indicated they wanted to save themselves for sex or for marriage. But also from that standpoint, this dearth of understanding could leave them exposed to a host of different sexual issues should they not have had the friends they could rely on. So they didn't have this understanding. Many of them were very naive about sex. As one of them said, my mom told me not to, but I don't know what sex is. So And overall, they felt the aspirations for their own lives were driven by what they saw in their own families and wanting to do something different. So they saw how their families were struggling, and they saw how the women in their families were catering to men, and they wanted to do something different, not only for themselves, but for their own children. So our limitations for this study were that we did only involve young women, and we did not differentiate between first and second generation immigrant experiences. And then lastly, and really interestingly, our cohort was in high school during COVID. So this lack of peer influence may have really been more because of that isolation. So overall, immigrant young women feel responsible for breaking these intergenerational cycles of harmful norms while also maintaining cultural values. And using different community tools to bridge this gap can help to support future generations with better equity and choice, and really freedom for women to define themselves. Okay, we're on the home stretch. We're so close to the end. So just to summarize everything, our first study, we conducted secondary analyses of quantitative data from rural Tanzania, and we found that gender equity can be protective against sexual risk. Adolescence is an important time to intervene, and that entire communities must be involved. Study 2 was our secondary qualitative analysis of focus group data in urban Tanzania. And we found here that community norms dictated the rejection of those who did kudanga, but it was still necessary for them to mitigate economic insecurity. Community involvement is needed to reduce the risk currently associated with transactional sex, specifically less severe sanctioning and better reporting mechanisms for violence. And then last, study 3, our qualitative analyses of in-depth interviews. What happens here? Oh, this is fun. Okay. This is what happened during your call. Everyone on Zoom, there's a fire drill. So I don't know, we'll be back.
Yes, we will.
Cool.
I must say your
It's never happened.
Well, this building has had real emergencies. Like I gave a talk here once, we had a gas leak. 2 years ago, we had a real fire. So when they have alarms in this building, you get out because it tends to be the real deal.
oh well, look at it as a good luck thing. You know, you just have this intervention
that.
from above.
Probably done without it, but you know.
Divine intervention. Anyway, to give you a break, drink some water. You were talking.
I put some chapstick on and took a drink of water, so we're good. We should be just another minute getting everybody settled. Thank you all on here for being patient.
No worries. I think you also have some messages in the chat if you want to look at it.
Thanks, Magna. Okay. Yes, Melinda. Nina. Oh, thanks, Melinda and Nina. Okay. You kind of are. You're like the boss.
Oh, that was refreshing.
Yeah, I just thought we could take a quick little break because everybody was getting tired.
I think we can all hold.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe halfway.
Yeah, this was a little, we let it go too long. So yeah. Intermission, we could do some yoga. Yeah, great. Okay. All right. I think this is everyone. If it's not, too bad.
Pretty much.
Yes, yes. Study 3. I don't know. Where were we? Do we remember anything from before that? Our qualitative analyses of in-depth interviews with African immigrant young women in the U.S. Oh, now this doesn't work again. That's great. Okay. Here we go. So we found that community norms influence relationship values and sexual decision-making of these immigrant young women, such that they felt responsible for simultaneously upholding cultural values and breaking intergenerational cycles of harmful gender norms to create better equity for future generations. Literally, this is the last slide. That's like... So to wrap it all up and talk about these public health implications, we're bringing it back to the social ecological model for Lorraine, actually, which is great because this model is her favorite. So from a structural and societal standpoint, we need to expand economic and educational opportunities for women and girls and incorporate gender into policymaking. So things like pay parity, protecting education for girls, marriage, child marriage laws, things of that nature at that level. At the community level, incorporating full communities into gender transformative education, not focusing just on girls, not even focusing just on adolescents. And then at the relational and individual levels, looking at things like comprehensive sex ed for both adolescents and their parents to understand how to better talk about it, acknowledging and addressing intergenerational cycles of silence, of stigma, sexism, and misogyny that harm women and girls, but ultimately everyone. So if you take nothing else away from this besides the fire drill, please remember whole communities must be involved in order to reinforce and reproduce these gender equitable attitudes at every single level of the model to really start to affect normative change. And lastly, I just have a few acknowledgements. That's my cat, if you know him. I first want to thank my committee. I want to thank all of you for being on this wild ride. Thank you. My committee, to Lorraine, thank you for teaching me to be a critical thinker like I never thought I could be, and that it's just as important to make a ripple as it is a splash. To Tia, I don't know where to start, so thank you for everything, for opening all these doors and providing me with so many opportunities and teaching me that smarter, not harder, is really better. I'll get there eventually. To Jennifer, thank you for your guidance on qualitative work. I really have learned so much from you and would have been lost in many of my analyses without you. And to Meghna, thank you so much for all of your expertise on transactional sex. It's been such an honor to learn from you. So all of you, thank you. The informal mentorship of both Rusajo Kajula and Nina Yamanis, I think they're both still here. Nina graciously allowed me to use her data for study 2. Thank you for trusting me with it. And Rusajo, thank you so much for teaching me so much about a culture that isn't my own and helping me to contextualize things. Also for telling me that if it doesn't make me happy, not to do it. To the CHHB faculty and department staff, Sarah Heavy's not here anymore, but she planted the seed at Remedy House 100 years ago, it feels like. And Greg, thank you for putting the fear of God and statistics in me. To all of the research teams that, again, have so graciously let me use their data, couldn't have done this without them. And then to my research assistants, Logan and Chelsea, who worked for free tirelessly all summer, helping me with paper 3. And also to everyone here, to all of my friends, to Bridget, to Tara, teaching me how to build variables, to my family, and to my cat, who tried to delete a lot of code and really distract me, but somehow we're still here. Okay, we made it. We survived. We're here. Thank you.
Although there was a little break in the the momentum, we do have time for questions.
There was a secondary outcome for one of the studies, study 1 or study 2.
Can you speak up?
Oh.
Oh yeah, because the Zoom
Yeah.
people. Should we put the microphone on? That's fine. Go ahead.
So I remember there being a secondary outcome. It was either for study 1 or study 2, but it was modern contraceptive use.
Yes.
So were there any measures of non-modern contraceptive use, and what were they?
There were, but we didn't use them in this data. So modern contraceptive use being things that they had received from clinics, and non-modern, and I will lean on Tia for this because I didn't use this. Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great
Yep.
presentation.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'm ready. Come on. I'm ready. Yeah. I'm not ready.
So the Tanzania data was really interesting, and I hope people here will read. That really was very moving as a woman. But one of the limitations that you described is the fact that the 2 Tanzanian studies involve lower SES women. And so I'm curious, given the focus on gender norms, what you think, and please feel free to speculate, what you think we might find if we did those studies with women who had more socioeconomic resources.
I think that's interesting. And I was actually just talking about this with Jake the other night. I think the lines that we draw between high and low income, anything, people, countries, whatever, we tend to think like, okay, people in low income settings need more help and they need different help or different things, which is true. But I think there is a transactional component to pretty much all partnerships between men and women, particularly if you're looking at them romantically. And I think we could have really done a lot with a lot of different things in this paper to look at transactional relationships among adolescents here. So, you go to a bar, you buy a drink, and then there's an implicit understanding that things might happen when you leave. And I think that research could benefit from sort of expanding and looking at all the nuances between relationships as opposed to just saying, okay, you're doing this to get money. Because as we saw in the Kudanga paper, it isn't just about money. And so how many women have we seen looking to gain social status by dating powerful men, or vice versa? I mean, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce is a great example. So there's a transactional component to all relationships. And I think if we took it to a high income setting, speculating here, but I think we would find many similarities. We would just call them different things, or they would look different because we aren't examining people who are saying, okay, you're doing this because there is a level of poverty here and a level of need that isn't present in those higher income situations. Yeah, Becca.
So you said that in the one focus group, Naga was not originally part of the scope. So I guess my question is like, how is like, whether it's the word Naga or the title or action, like how is it used in like the social context in Tanzania? Is it a word spoken like, oh, like Naga happened, or is it like just the actions that occur and then like it's titled as that later?
So they were talking about doing DACA, and so it's a verb. It's definitely like, and the research team was like, what is this word? What are you saying? And so they wanted to explore it more, but it's very much a thing that one does. And the primary focus of it is the money component. So it's, you do Donga for money. And like that, there's like so much of like the focus groups, like there's like line after line that says you do Donga for money, you do Donga for money. And it was to kind of get a better understanding of like, well, what money for what? How does this work? And so they had never, as far as I understand, the research team wasn't familiar with the term at all. Yeah.
Okay, so throughout, your conclusion was we need more community level gender transformative interventions. Understanding there's not a correct answer to this and it's complicated. What are your thoughts about how you could do that when there's obviously going to be social resistance? I mean, we see in the United States, we can't teach sex education at school. So
I was hoping someone would ask this question. I'm ready for it. So the first is that there's no easy way to do it. And this isn't, we're not looking at something that's going to change tomorrow. This is probably generational change. But a good way to do it is to find people who are bought in. So looking at, so Megan and I, when we worked at Crisis Services, did a lot of work in schools. And so we would identify school partners who wanted us to come in and talk about sexual violence. And so you'd get a principal on board, or you get a guidance counselor on board, somebody who is in some position of power to bring you in and say, can you talk about this with like my other adults? And then can we bring this into the kids? And I would like to say that's a linear process, but like we got kicked out of a bunch of schools. We got brought back to a bunch of schools. So I think identifying the allies in the process, so the people who are going to give you access, is important. And I think really, to a certain point, like when you're looking at whole communities and you're looking at adults, like, and this is why it's generational change, some people are never going to change their mind. You're always going to have that school superintendent who's like, our kids don't need to learn about violence. That doesn't happen here. And I think it's very heartening from what I've seen when we've gone into the high schools and talked to kids, like they're very much more aware of all of this than like even my generation ever was. So I think that shift will happen if we keep talking about it in any place we can access and wherever we can pull allies in. So looking at key stakeholders, key community members, if you get a politician who's really on board and wants to talk about it. Really, I think part of what causes so much of these issues is that this we found in study 3, the cycle of silence and that stigma that arises from it. And so the more people we can have talking about this, the better. And whether it's a superintendent or a 15-year-old kid, or, look at what Greta Thunberg has done with climate change, I think that's like, we take it wherever we can get into those avenues and find the allies where we can.
So ripples.
Yes.
Lots of
No splashes. This isn't a splash. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about what the older women are doing to lost the conversation. If you ever spoke about with the author of their time where people have their need for some words no longer considered anymore and
Yeah. So what she said was, is there, with the focus group that had the older women in it, what did they bring to the conversations? And was there ever a cut point? So like, you can't do Kudanga anymore. That's so interesting. And no, that didn't come up at any point. But those women who were older, so the primary study was like looking at social networks, and those women were very important to the cohesion of that group. So there were like different like girl groups, women's groups that were meeting. And so each one of them had like X number of women in the group, and these older women, and again, I didn't really like bring that out in this paper, but there was so much information. It was so interesting to read how they were sort of like the wisdom and the guidance for the younger women. And that is particularly in this group, at least from my understanding, why they stayed, because they were so integral to the cohesion of that group. And they sort of provided sexual health knowledge for these other women, because again, there's this dearth of understanding. There's not wide education available for sexual health. So the older women have like been there, done that. And so they provided the roadmap for the younger women to sort of understand. And it was really interesting because no one in that group personally owned up to doing Kudanga. Nowhere in the focus group data did someone say, I did it. They all talked about people they knew who did it. Because again, even in those spaces, even in those groups, like no one was discussing it. So I think that's a really interesting, you know, they gave guidance, but they also like, they're still like, it didn't feel like it was a safe space to talk about it. Does anyone, oh wait, sorry, there's questions in the chat. No, there's not. There's comments in the chat. Okay, that's fine. Anyone online have questions though?
All right. Well, thank you for not just coming at the beginning, but returning after the fire drill.
Thank you.
This is a great turnout, and I hope that you learned from all the wonderful research that Kate has done and probably will continue to do.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, and again, congratulations, Kate. You did an excellent presentation. We're really, really pleased. As you probably are aware, now that the formal presentation is over, the committee will stay to meet with Kate and to meet with Meghna, who is in London. And just want to thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone. If anybody ever wants to talk about this, you know where to find me. I clearly love to talk about this. So okay, yeah. Do you want me to?
Go back to the first one.
Should we do the first one?
Yeah.
Well, the title.
Thank you for coming back.